Here's what happened in a child-related case a few years ago, and you might be shocked by it.
The pain that this child probably endured. And from what I heard, Gabriel was a kind, loving individual who just wanted to be loved. And so, you want to say that the conduct was animalistic, but that would be wrong, because even animals know how to take care of their young, some to an extent that they...
For the last 5 years, Gabriel has been number 28 in my classroom. I don't assign number 28 to another student because I feel that it's only his number now. And it's a way for me to honor him in my classroom. It almost makes it like he's still here.
The more shocking thing is that the perpetrator was the victim's own mother, and she got a life sentence without parole.
Thank you. On February 15, 2018, the defendant, Pearl Sinthia Fernandez, entered a plea to murder in the first degree and further admitted the special circumstance of intentional murder by torture, pursuant to Penal Code Section 190.2, subsection A18, the defendant having waived all appellate and habeas rights as part of the plea agreement. The court ultimately finding that the defendant's plea and waiver of all of her constitutional and statutory rights were made knowingly, willingly, voluntarily, and intelligently, and further that she understood all of the consequences of her plea. Moreover, the record reflects that the defendant confirmed that she was intellectually capable of entering and understanding her plea agreement. Accordingly, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that the defendant shall be sentenced to a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole for the underlying murder charge, coupled with the special torture special circumstance allegation.
This all went down back in 2013 in Palmdale, California. We see a young boy facing ongoing mistreatment that led to his tragic death, with multiple reports of warning signs ignored along the way, and a system that failed to step in despite clear red flags. The real outrage here is how the Child Protection Services and authorities dropped the ball, letting the situation spiral out of control, even after alerts from teachers and family. How could something like this slip through the cracks for so long? This is the case of Gabriel Fernandez. The broken family. Gabriel Daniel Fernandez was born on February 20, 2005, in Palmdale, California. His mother, Pearl Sinthia Fernandez, was just 21 at the time, born herself on August 29, 1983, to Robert and Sandra Fernandez. Pearl's early life set a pattern of hardship that rippled through the family. Growing up in a household where her father, Robert, spent much of his time behind bars on various charges, Pearl described a childhood filled with neglect from her mother, Sandra, who she claimed was harsh and inattentive. By age 9, Pearl had started experimenting with controlled substances that became a crutch amid the chaos. At 11, she ran away from home, escaping what she saw as an unbearable environment. School didn't last long for her either. She dropped out in the 8th grade, cutting short any formal education and leaving her to navigate adolescence without much structure. Pearl's teenage years brought even more turmoil. She faced traumatic experiences that shaped her deeply, including an alleged attempt by her uncle to assault when she was young. Later, as a teen, she endured a harrowing ordeal where a group of men held her hostage and assaulted her repeatedly over several days, an event that pushed her toward thoughts of ending her own life. These incidents left lasting scars, contributing to a series of mental health challenges that were diagnosed later. In 2011, for instance, a cognitive assessment revealed that her verbal comprehension skills were equivalent to those of a typical second-grade student, pointing to developmental delays. Doctors also identified depressive disorder, a possible personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other issues tied to her past. Despite all this, Pearl entered into a relationship with Arnold Contreras, Gabriel's father, and together they had 4 children, building a family amid ongoing struggles. Arnold Contreras, Gabriel's biological father, had his own history intertwined with crime and incarceration. Involved in substances-related offenses and even armed robbery at points, Arnold spent time in prison, which meant he wasn't consistently present during the early years of his children's lives. His relationship with Pearl was rocky from the start, marked by arguments and separations. At one point, Pearl faced pending charges for threatening to stab Arnold during a heated dispute, highlighting the volatile dynamics between them. The couple's 4 kids included Gabriel as the second child, with an older brother named Ezekiel, who was around 8 years older, born roughly in 1997, and a younger sister, Virginia, about 3 years younger than Gabriel, born around 2002. There was also another sibling, completing the quartet, though details on that child's exact placement in the timeline remain sparse in the records we've pulled. The family operated in a lower socioeconomic bracket, living in Palmdale, a working-class suburb north of Los Angeles known for its affordable housing, but also for pockets of poverty and limited opportunities. Jobs were unsteady, and the household relied on whatever income came in, often supplemented by government assistance programs that became a point of contention later on. Right after Gabriel's birth, Pearl left him at the hospital for 3 days, essentially relinquishing immediate care, before arrangements were made for him to go elsewhere. Instead of staying with his parents, Gabriel was placed with his great-uncle, Michael Lemos Carranza, and Michael's partner, David Martinez. This setup provided a stable home for the infant, far from the immediate conflicts in Pearl and Arnold's lives. Michael, part of the extended Fernandez family, took on the role willingly, creating what seemed like a nurturing environment in their household. For the first 4 years of his life, Gabriel lived there, away from the direct influence of his mother's turbulent history and his father's legal troubles. But family tensions simmered beneath the surface, particularly around Michael's relationship with David. In 2009, when Gabriel was 4, a major shift occurred due to underlying family conflicts. His grandfather, Robert Fernandez, disapproved strongly of Michael and David's same-sex relationship, viewing it through a lens of traditional values that clashed with the couple's lifestyle. This disapproval led to Gabriel being moved out of their care and into the home of his grandparents, Robert and Sandra, in Palmdale. The transition wasn't just about logistics, it reflected deeper rifts within the family, where generational differences and personal beliefs created divides. Robert, with his own history of incarceration, and Sandra, who Pearl had accused of neglect in her own upbringing, now stepped in as primary caregivers. Their home became Gabriel's base for the next few years, offering a different kind of stability amid the broader family dysfunction. We see here how these interpersonal clashes, rooted in homophobia, past grievances, and differing views on family, dictated the boy's early movements, bouncing him between relatives. Pearl's extended family added layers to these dynamics. Her aunt, Elizabeth Carranza, and Elizabeth's partner, offered contrasting perspectives on Pearl's behavior in relationships. They claimed that Pearl was often the controlling, aggressive one in her partnerships, pushing back against any narratives where she positioned herself solely as a victim. This aunt-niece relationship highlighted ongoing family disputes, where allegations flew back and forth, eroding trust. Meanwhile, Arnold's absences due to his criminal record meant he played a minimal role in day-to-day decisions, leaving gaps that relatives like Michael and the grandparents filled. The overall family structure was fragmented, with siblings like Isaim and Virginia experiencing their own versions of this instability, though they remained more directly under Pearl's influence at times. By September 2012, another change loomed. Pearl, now living with her boyfriend Isauro Aguirre, born on June 13, 1980, decided to bring Gabriel back into her household in Palmdale. Isauro, who worked as a security guard, entered the picture as a stepfather figure, altering the family composition once more. The motivation for this reunion included practical elements, such as qualifying for welfare benefits that came with having more children in the home. But it also stirred concerns among other family members, who recalled Pearl's track record with her kids. The household they formed was modest, squeezed into an apartment in a neighborhood where economic pressures were evident, high unemployment rates, reliance on public aid, and the daily grind of making ends meet. Conflicts didn't vanish. If anything, bringing Gabriel and amplified existing tensions, from Pearl's unresolved issues with Arnold to the broader family's skepticism about her parenting capabilities. Diving deeper, we note how socioeconomic factors wove through every aspect. Palmdale, part of the Antelope Valley, attracted families like the Fernandezes seeking cheaper living compared to Los Angeles proper. But it came with trade-offs: limited access to quality education, healthcare, and jobs. Pearl's lack of education and mental health struggles compounded this, making steady employment elusive. Arnold's criminal history similarly barred him from many opportunities, perpetuating a cycle of poverty. Family gatherings, when they happened, devolved into arguments over money, child rearing, or old wounds from Pearl's childhood. For instance, her runaway episode at 11 wasn't just a one-off. It stemmed from a home environment she described as toxic, with her mother's alleged ingots clashing against her father's absences. These stories circulated among relatives, fueling ongoing debates about responsibility and blame. For how everything went wrong, it's needed to make clear that we got clear warning signs in Gabriel's situation that went unnoticed or unheeded, really highlighting the missed opportunities that could have changed everything. From as early as 2005, when Gabriel was just a baby, there were suspicions of mistreatment floating around in the family circle. Relatives like his grandparents and uncle started noticing odd behaviors and physical marks that didn't add up, raising red flags about how he was being handled at home. These initial concerns weren't isolated. They built up over time, but somehow, they didn't trigger the kind of response that might have pulled him out of harm's way right then. Fast forward to late 2012 and early 2013, and the signs became even more glaring at school, where Gabriel spent a good chunk of his day. His teacher, Jennifer Garcia, at Summerwind Elementary in Palmdale, was one of the first outsiders to spot the troubling indicators. She observed bruises and cuts scattered across his face and body, marks that appeared fresh and unexplained. These weren't just random scrapes from play. They were patterned in ways that suggested something systematic was going on. Gabriel's nose would bleed without an obvious cause, his lips swollen like he'd taken a hit, and there were burn marks resembling something hot dotted on his skin. His hair looked like patches had been yanked out, leaving bald spots that he tried to hide. On top of that, he showed clear signs of being undernourished, thin frame, lack of energy, slower growth than his peers, which science tells us points to chronic neglect in providing basic needs like food. Experts in child health explain that such malnutrition leads to delayed physical development, weakened immune systems, and overall frailty, making it a stark indicator that a child's well-being is compromised over time. Jennifer noted these repeatedly, but the reports she filed didn't lead to immediate action from the authorities, missing a critical window where school officials and social services could have collaborated to get him medical checks or temporary placement. The blame shifts to the Department of Children and Family Services caseworkers, who reviewed these alerts, but deemed them insufficient for escalation, overlooking how these physical manifestations screamed for urgent intervention. Gabriel's behavior at school added another layer to these warning signs, painting a picture of a kid in deep emotional turmoil. He often did frightened, jumping at sudden noises or avoiding eye contact with adults, which psychologists link to ongoing trauma responses. Kids in such states tend to withdraw socially, showing anxiety or even bursts of aggression, as a way to cope with internal chaos caused by repeated negative experiences. In Gabriel's case, he would sometimes harm himself, which research in child psychology attributes to internalized mistreatment, where the child mimics or redirects pain as a maladaptive behavior stemming from emotional or physical distress. Studies show that self-harm in young children often emerges from environments where they feel powerless, leading to disorders like oppositional fight behavior or even early signs of PTSD. He also dressed in long sleeves and pants even on scorching Palmdale days, a classic attempt to conceal injuries, as experts note that children will go to great lengths to hide marks if they're afraid of repercussions or further harm. This clothing choice, mismatched with the weather, is a scientifically recognized red flag for efforts to cover up physical evidence of mistreatment. Jennifer Garcia heard that his mother and her boyfriend used objects like baseball bats or belts, details he shared in moments of vulnerability. But his stories sometimes shifted due to fear, a common phenomenon where kids alter narratives to protect themselves or their caregivers. Child development specialists explain that such inconsistent retellings aren't lies but survival mechanisms, proving the depth of the psychological impact. These behavioral cues were reported multiple times, yet social workers like Stephanie Rodriguez and Patricia Clement, assigned to his case, didn't pursue in-depth evaluations or home removals, squandering opportunities to connect him with therapists or safe havens that could have halted the progression. Shockingly, family members outside the immediate household also caught wind of these issues, adding eyewitness accounts that could have bolstered interventions. His grandparents, Robert and Sandra, noticed unusual marks and behaviors during visits, like how Gabriel seemed hesitant to go home or flinched at raised voices. His uncle, Michael Limos, who had cared for him earlier, picked up on changes in his demeanor, more subdued, less playful, when they interacted. These relatives voiced concerns over the years, starting from those early 2005 suspicions, when Gabriel was tiny and showing unexplained fussiness or minor marks that didn't align with normal baby handling. Science on infant development highlights how even subtle signs, like excessive crying or avoidance of touch, can signal early mistreatment, leading to attachment disorders if unaddressed. Yet, these family reports to authorities went without rigorous follow-up, allowing the situation to fester. The responsibility lies with the social services supervisors who oversaw the case files, but didn't cross-reference these familial insights with school reports, bypassing chances for family court involvement or emergency placements that might have relocated Gabriel back to safer relatives. The last day. For the pivotal day in the case, May 22, 2013, in the family's home in Palmdale, California, around 10:45 p.m., when Pearl Fernandez picked up the phone and dialed 911. Her voice steady as she reported that her son Gabriel wasn't breathing after what she described as a simple accident, falling from his bed and hitting his head.
911 emergency.
Yes, I would like to, my son is not breathing.
Your son is what?
He's not breathing.
Hold on 1 second. I'm going to transfer you over to the fire department. Don't hang up.
My son is 8 years old.
It's your son, okay. And he's not breathing?
No.
Does he have a seizure?
No, he was wrestling with my other son, and I came in and he just was unconscious.
Okay, do you have the paramedics on the way right now? Are you right there with him?
Yes, I'm right here.
Okay, do you know how to do CPR?
I'm just doing the compulsion from the chest, you know.
Okay,
and
you
I
need
should
to
be
breathe for him. If he's not breathing, you need to do 2 breaths and 30 compressions.
In the audio from that call, which we've reviewed in our research, Pearl sounded composed, laying out the details like it was just an everyday mishap, without the kind of frantic urgency you'd expect from a parent in a life or death situation. She mentioned trying to wake him but getting no response, sticking firmly to the narrative of an unintentional tumble. This calm demeanor raised early questions for us as we dig into the records, because it contrasted sharply with the gravity of what responders would soon discover, hinting at a possible effort to downplay the incident from the get-go. Minutes after the call, firefighters and paramedics from the local emergency services rushed to the scene, arriving to find Gabriel unconscious on the floor, not responding to any attempts to rouse him. The team worked quickly to stabilize him, noting right away that his condition seemed more complicated than a straightforward fall, though they focused on immediate life-saving measures like checking airways and starting CPR. Pearl was there, reiterating her story to the responders, maintaining that composed front as they loaded Gabriel into the ambulance. Isauro Aguirre, her boyfriend who lived with them, was also present at the house during this chaos, backing up Pearl's account without hesitation. He described the supposed accident in similar terms, showing no outward signs of guilt or distress beyond what might pass for concern in the moment. Perhaps a calculated move to align their stories, as we see in many true crime breakdowns where perpetrators try to control the initial narrative. His cooperation at the scene didn't waver, but it would soon face scrutiny as more details emerged. From the home, Gabriel was rushed to nearby Antelope Valley Hospital for initial treatment, where doctors and nurses sprang into action to assess his state. Upon examination, the medical staff quickly picked up on discrepancies that didn't add up. The boy's physical condition showed signs that suggested repeated issues over time, not just a one-off bump from a bed. One nurse later recalled in statements how the marks and overall presentation raised immediate red flags, prompting them to question the parents' explanation. Pearl, waiting at the hospital, continued to push the accident story, appearing unruffled even as staff pressed for more details, which only amplified the growing suspicion among the team. Isauro arrived shortly after, echoing the same tale, but his responses to basic questions about the evening's events started to show minor inconsistencies, like vague timelines that didn't fully sync with Pearl's version. We note in the reports how this hospital phase became a turning point, with the medical professionals' trained eyes spotting patterns that a layperson might miss, leading them to alert authorities without delay. The mismatch between the claimed accident and Gabriel's actual presentation became impossible to ignore for the doctors. They documented how a simple fall couldn't account for the array of indicators on his body, Things like older bruises in various healing stages and other unexplained marks that pointed to something ongoing rather than acute. Pediatric specialists emphasize in general literature that injuries from genuine accidents tend to be isolated and match the described mechanism, like a single impact site with fresh swelling, whereas recurring or mismatched signs often signal deeper problems. Here, the boy's symptoms, labored breathing, unresponsiveness, coupled with those visible inconsistencies, clashed directly with the parents' straightforward fall narrative, fueling doubts that this was accidental. The staff didn't hesitate. One doctor made the call to involve Child Protective Services and law enforcement right then, recognizing the protocol for such red flags. Pearl's reaction to these probing questions shifted slightly. She became defensive, insisting it was just a mishap and that Gabriel was clumsy, but her lack of visible panic stood out, almost as if she was rehearsing a script. Isauro, meanwhile, tried to deflect by focusing on unrelated details, like what Gabriel had eaten that day, which only heightened the medical team's unease. Deciding that Antelope Valley's facilities weren't equipped for the level of care needed, the doctors arranged for Gabriel's transfer to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, a specialized pediatric center better suited for complex cases. During the transport, paramedics monitored him closely, noting no improvement in his condition, which further underscored the severity that a mere bed fall shouldn't cause. Meanwhile, deputies from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department were already en route. Summoned by the hospital alerts, they split their efforts between securing the home scene in Palmdale and interviewing at the hospital, methodically piecing together the timeline. At the house, investigators photographed the layout, noting the bed in question and searching for any evidence that might support or refute the fall story, things like the height of the bed or signs of struggle that didn't fit. Back at the hospital, they spoke first with the medical personnel, who laid out the inconsistencies in detail, stressing how the boy's overall state suggested prolonged issues rather than an isolated event. One deputy recalled the palpable tension as Pearl was confronted with these observations. She stuck to her guns, repeating the fall narrative with a flat effect, denying any prior problems and showing frustration at the doubts, which only made her seem less credible. Isauro, questioned separately, cooperated at first by answering basics, but faltered when pressed on the exact sequence, his story wavering just enough to mirror the medical mismatches, like claiming no unusual behavior from Gabriel earlier that day despite evident signs otherwise. The siblings' reactions added another dimension to the unfolding discovery. Ezekiel, the older brother around 16 at the time, appeared subdued initially, avoiding eye contact with deputies as if weighing his words carefully. Virginia, younger at about 11, clutched her brother's arm. Clutched her volumes until gentle prompting from a social worker elicited responses that hinted at a different reality. Mentions of Gabriel being hurt before, that clashed with the one-time accident tale. These kids' hesitancy, common in such high-stress scenarios, reflected the family dynamics at play, but their eventual disclosures provided crucial contrasts to the parents' unified front. Family relatives like the grandparents Robert and Sandra, and Uncle Michael, were notified soon after the hospital admission, their responses a mix of shock and immediate skepticism toward the accident explanation. Robert, in particular, expressed outright doubt over the phone to investigators, recalling past concerns that made the fall story ring hollow. His voice laced with anger and disbelief as he demanded answers. As the night wore on into May 23, the investigative momentum built rapidly. Deputies coordinated with hospital staff to document everything, from photos of Gabriel's condition to statements from everyone present. The overarching conflict, the simple fall versus the complex presentation, drove the quick escalation, with forensics experts later noting in general terms how such mismatches often accelerate suspicions in child cases. Pearl's arrest came that morning at the hospital on suspicion of endangering a child, a direct result of those glaring inconsistencies. When cuffed, she maintained her composure, protesting innocence and clinging to the accident line. Even as deputies read her rights, her denial firm but undercut by the mounting evidence from medical reports. Isauro's arrest followed suit the same day, charged with attempted murder, based on the intent inferred from the discrepancies. He went along without resistance at first, but his cooperation cracked under questioning, with answers that didn't square with the physical findings, like minimizing any role in the evening's events despite being home. Throughout this rapid sequence, The medical team's proactive stance stood out. They didn't wait, filing reports instantly to law enforcement about the non-matching narrative and condition, a move that experts praise as following best practices to protect vulnerable kids. Their detailed notes highlighted how a fall wouldn't explain the layered indicators, pushing the case from medical emergency to criminal probe in hours. Relatives' reactions amplified the divide. The grandparents arrived at the hospital distraught, their shock turning to pointed questions about what really happened, voicing long-held worries that made the accident claims seem implausible. Uncle Michael's response, upon hearing, was one of quiet fury, aligning with family history that cast doubt on Pearl's version from the start. We see in these moments how the collective reactions, from calm parents to skeptical kin and vigilant medics, exposed the fractures in the story, leading to those swift arrests before the full picture even emerged. The siblings, shuffled to safety amid the arrests, began opening up more, their words adding fuel to the investigative fire, though their initial silence spoke to the fear that had kept things hidden. This chain of events, from that late-night call to the handcuffs clicking shut, underscores the pivotal role of those first responders in unraveling a facade that had held for too long. The testimony. We're piecing together the post-arrest phase of the investigation for this case on the channel, kicking off right after Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were taken into custody on May 23, 2013, with detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department launching initial interrogations at the hospital and then at the station. Pearl stuck to her story during those first sessions, insisting that Gabriel's injuries stemmed from an accidental fall off the bed, flat out denying any other involvement or prior issues, her demeanor steady as she repeated the details without much deviation. We see in the reports how this narrative aimed to frame everything as a tragic mishap, but it quickly ran into roadblocks when cross-referenced with emerging evidence. Isauro, on the other hand, started out cooperative, claiming Gabriel had a habit of self-inflicted harm and pointing to a supposed bike accident from days earlier as the cause of some marks, though his account clashed head-on with the medical findings that suggested a different timeline and origin. Detectives noted these inconsistencies early, using them to probe deeper, but Isauro held his ground initially, perhaps buying time as the probe expanded. From there, the team shifted to gathering physical evidence at the family apartment in Palmdale, conducting a thorough search that turned up items like bloodstains in key areas, holes in the walls consistent with BB gun use, and a wooden bat with traces linked back to Gabriel. This sweep wasn't just routine, it provided tangible links that contradicted the accident claims, helping build a foundation for the case as investigators cataloged everything meticulously for later analysis. We can trace how these discoveries fed directly into follow-up questions, turning the focus toward corroborating witnesses who could fill in the gaps. Among the most pivotal were the statements from Gabriel's siblings, starting with his older brother Ezekiel, who gave detailed testimony about the household dynamics leading up to that final day. Ezekiel recounted specific events, including how Gabriel was made to consume inappropriate items and described instances where he was struck with objects such as a baseball bat, a metal buckled belt, a coat hanger, and a wooden stick. He also spoke of his brother had accident with a BB gun in sensitive areas labeled with derogatory terms like gay. Forced into girthing as punishment and confined in a locked cabinet, Ezekiel pinpointed the critical moment on May 23, 2013, when Gabriel failed to clean up toys, leading to a confrontation where he screamed before going silent, a sequence that aligned with the timeline of the emergency call. This testimony wasn't easy, Ezekiel admitted to initial hesitation, shaped by the environment at home. Gabriel's younger sister Virginia, 11 years old then, backed up much of this in her own interview, confirming patterns like repeated punches from Aguirre, Pearl breaking Gabriel's front teeth, more BB gun incidents, handcuffing inside the cabinet, the girls' clothing episodes, and witnessing the decisive blow where Aguirre punched Gabriel down, leaving him unresponsive before he was placed under a shower stream prior to authorities being contacted. Virginia's account added layers, showing how the siblings observed these routines firsthand, and her details meshed with Ezekiel's to create a cohesive picture for investigators. Both kids revealed how Pearl had coached them on what to say to social workers and police about any visible marks, instructing them to lie and attribute everything to accidents or self-harm. with Ezekiel confessing he complied out of fear of similar treatment. This element of directed deception became a key thread, illustrating attempts to cover tracks over months, and detectives used it to unravel earlier reports that had been dismissed. Photographic evidence from the home search played a supporting role too, with shots of the bedroom revealing 2 beds, but indications that Gabriel often slept in a box-like setup most of the time, which raised questions about daily living conditions and contradicted any image of a normal household. These images weren't just snapshots, they helped visualize the statements from the siblings, providing context that strengthened the overall narrative emerging from the interrogations. We note how the team cross-referenced these with hospital records, building a timeline that exposed gaps in the parents' initial stories. Another angle came from the child counselor involved earlier, who testified about discovering a note from Gabriel and calling 911. Though the complaint was dismissed for lacking a specific plan, a missed signal that later tied into the broader investigation. Diving deeper into that note, which stands out as one of the most heartbreaking details in the records. It was a letter written by Gabriel himself, handed over by Pearl to a social worker during a home visit about a month before the final incident, right in the tail end of ongoing checks. The content was raw, with Gabriel expressing affection toward his mother in phrases like, "I love you so much, I'll kill myself," and "I'll love you until you die," words that on the surface seemed like a child's devotion, but carried heavier undertones when examined. Investigators learned through testimony that Pearl and Isauro had forced Gabriel to pen this, aiming to shift blame onto him for any self-harm tendencies, tied to incidents where he played with dolls and faced ridicule with terms like gay. This coercion wasn't isolated. It fit a pattern of manipulating perceptions, and Pearl's decision to submit the letter was strategic. She presented it as proof of Gabriel's love for her, while implying he had mental health issues, deflecting from any mistreatment at home. The social worker who received it knew of its existence, but didn't escalate the report promptly, a lapse that later became part of the scrutiny on oversight, with the letter entering court files as evidence linked to charges against those workers for child mistreatment and falsifying records. The counselor's involvement added weight. Upon finding the note, they dialed emergency services, but the response fell short due to the absence of concrete details, leaving it as another overlooked piece until the full probe brought it to light. As the statements piled up, detectives looped in medical personnel for corroboration, pulling testimony from the firefighter James Cermak, who described Gabriel's body showing marks on every inch, details that directly challenged the accident narrative. Forensic pathologist James Kemp-Ribe weighed in too, ruling the cause as blunt force trauma combined with child neglect, remarking he'd never seen so many skin injuries on a kid, which underscored the extent without dwelling on specifics. Law enforcement officers like Ronald McCarthy contributed by recalling interrogations where Isauro attributed widespread bruising to Gabriel's anger-fueled self-harm or a bike mishap, claims that didn't hold up. Erica Martinez, another deputy, observed Gabriel with extensive bruising, lumps, cuts, swollen shut eyes, a neck brace, and small objects under the skin, noting no family member rode in the ambulance with him, a detail that hinted at detachment. Teacher Jennifer Garcia's input bridged back to earlier signs, reporting her calls to social services after incidents like Gabriel arriving with a bleeding lip from a belt buckle, black eyes, bruises, and even demonstrating cocaine snorting motions, which she flagged as concerning. Detective Timothy O'Quinn highlighted how prior abuse investigators failed to fully undress Gabriel for checks, missing opportunities to spot issues. For more details about the mother's role in this situation, focusing on her own childhood mistreatment and how it led to similar circumstances for her child. Pearl Fernandez's early years were marked by a series of traumatic events that shaped her path. Pearl bore direct responsibility for the mistreatment that led to Gabriel's death, actively participating in the neglect and harm that culminated in her life sentence without parole. She failed to prioritize her son's safety, rejecting offers of intervention from social agencies and concealing warning signs by attributing them to accidents or Gabriel's own self-harm tendencies. Even with diagnoses of psychological disorders and developmental disabilities that impacted her behavior control, Pearl was held fully criminally accountable due to her active involvement in the mistreatment, as courts determined her conditions didn't absolve her actions. The cycle of mistreatment stands out here. with Pearl's history of being mistreated as a child contributing to heightened risk assessments by child protection agencies, ultimately leading her to recreate a similar harmful setting for Gabriel. This wasn't a break from the past. Instead, her behaviors toward him mirrored intergenerational patterns, where she perpetuated the neglect and harm rather than interrupting the loop. We see this in how she maintained the household dynamics that echoed her own upbringing, passing on the unresolved issues without seeking change. Science sheds light on why this happens, showing that individuals mistreated in childhood face a higher risk of mistreating their own kids through learned behaviors and trauma responses that impair parenting skills and emotional regulation. Research highlights how childhood trauma can trigger disorders like PTSD and depression, boosting the likelihood of repeating mistreatment via environmental and psychological mechanisms, as outlined in studies on child mistreatment dynamics. These cycles often tie into factors like poverty and welfare challenges, but the core driver remains unaddressed trauma that weakens a ability to safeguard their children. Programs like structured decision-making incorporate a parent's mistreatment history as a key risk factor, grounded in evidence that early trauma elevates the chances of inflicting harm on the next generation. Broader studies on child mistreatment reveal increased mortality rates and long-term health issues, with the cycle persisting through modeled behaviors and a lack of psychological support to break free. In Pearl's case, this scientific framework helps explain the repetition without excusing it, as her choices directly shaped the tragic outcome despite available red flags. We note how experts emphasize that breaking these cycles requires early intervention, therapy, and support systems, yet when those fail, the responsibility falls squarely on the adult to seek help rather than continue the pattern. Pearl's refusal to engage meaningfully with resources amplified the risks, aligning with data showing that unresolved parental trauma often leads to escalated household dangers for kids. This interplay of personal history and decision-making underscores the preventable nature of such tragedies, where science points to pathways that went unused here. Overall, the discussion around Pearl's role reveals a stark example of intergenerational mistreatment, where her past experiences didn't mitigate her culpability, but instead fueled the environment that harmed Gabriel. Scientific explanations reinforce that while trauma can predispose someone to these behaviors, accountability remains, especially when opportunities for intervention are dismissed. We pull from various studies to highlight how mistreatment's ripple effects demand systemic awareness to halt the repetition in families like this one. The ignorance. Digging deeper into the criticisms aimed at the agencies for their oversights in handling this situation for the channel, we need to focus on how those lapses drew widespread backlash and where the blame should land. The Department of Children and Family Services came under heavy fire for systemic failures in safeguarding Gabriel, with many pointing out that his preventable death stemmed from inadequate risk assessments and a lack of decisive action when red flags appeared. This echoed in public outcry, where experts argued that the agency's protocols fell short, allowing the mistreatment to continue unchecked despite opportunities to intervene. This wasn't just isolated commentary, it sparked internal probes within LA County, highlighting how the department's handling of cases like this one exposed deep-rooted issues in their operational framework. The Netflix series, The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, amplified these critiques, shining a spotlight on DCFS's lack of accountability and the broader flaws in the child protection system that let such oversights occur. Through interviews and reconstructions, the show illustrated how multiple agencies failed to connect the dots, revealing vulnerabilities that critics said had been ignored for years. We note how this media exposure fueled national discussions, with viewers and advocates demanding answers for why the system didn't step in sooner. Similarly, LA County DCFS faced accusations of disregarding clear indicators, which triggered not only internal investigations but also public condemnations of their case management processes. Reports from the time detailed how these lapses weren't unique, prompting calls for transparency and reform to prevent recurrence in other families. Experts and the public alike hammered on the poor coordination between DCFS, law enforcement, and schools, arguing that this disconnect directly contributed to the failure to act in time. For instance, we pull from analyses showing how reports from educators weren't adequately followed up by social workers or police, creating silos that let critical information slip through. This lack of collaboration became a central theme in critiques, with child welfare organizations stressing that integrated efforts could have altered the outcome. The establishment of the Blue Ribbon Commission marked a formal response to these shortcomings, tasked with probing DCFS missteps and identifying gaps in staff training and oversight. Their findings, released in reports, underscored problems like insufficient preparation for handling complex cases, which critics used to argue for immediate overhauls in how workers were supervised on the ground. Prosecutors and courts joined the chorus, lambasting social workers for their negligence, which initially led to criminal charges against them for not fulfilling their duties. We track how this legal scrutiny painted a picture of individual accountability within a flawed structure, with arguments in hearings emphasizing that these workers had the tools but didn't apply them rigorously. Media outlets like the LA Times and Atlantic piled on, highlighting what they called institutional indifference, with in-depth articles calling for systemic changes to address the apathy that allowed oversights to persist. These pieces often feed quotes from insiders and advocates, weaving narratives of how budget cuts and bureaucratic hurdles compounded the issues, urging readers to push for accountability at higher levels. Child advocacy groups zeroed in on the resource shortages and overwhelming caseloads at DCFS, critiquing how these factors bred errors that could have been avoided with better funding and support. We see this in statements from organizations like the Children's Law Center, which argued that understaffing led to rushed decisions and missed follow-ups, turning what should have been protective measures into mere paperwork. This perspective shifted some blame to administrative levels, suggesting that frontline failures were symptoms of deeper organizational neglect. Overall, the wave of criticism painted DCFS as emblematic of broader child welfare woes, with calls for audits and policy shifts gaining traction in the wake of the exposure. Shifting to responsibility, the four social workers, Stephanie Rodriguez, Patricia Clement, Kevin Baum, and Gregory Merritt, faced direct accusations of dereliction, though those charges were ultimately dismissed in 2020 after appeals highlighted legal complexities around their roles. Despite the drop, public sentiment held them accountable for not escalating concerns, with details from the case files showing lapses in documentation and visits that critics said should have triggered removals. We examine how their actions, or inactions, became focal points in discussions, representing the human element in systemic breakdowns. DCFS as an entity shouldered the primary blame for these institutional failures, resulting in firings and internal reforms aimed at tightening procedures. Reports from the period detail how the department acknowledged shortcomings, implementing new training modules, but advocates argued this came too late, underscoring the need for proactive leadership. Supervisors and DCF's executives bore responsibility for inadequate oversight and training, as outlined in analyses from the Netflix series and journalistic investigations. These sources pointed to a top-down culture where metrics overshadowed thorough casework, with leaders failing to ensure workers had the guidance needed for high-risk situations. We note instances where memos and reviews revealed ignored recommendations for better monitoring, placing the onus on management to foster a more vigilant environment. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department shared partial accountability for not thoroughly investigating incoming reports, with critiques highlighting delayed responses or incomplete inquiries that could have prompted earlier interventions. Sheriff's logs and testimonies showed gaps in collaboration, where law enforcement deferred too readily to social services without independent verification. The justice system and LA County government faced blame for insufficient resources and policies that perpetuated these vulnerabilities, leading to patterns seen in similar incidents across the region. Budget allocations and policy frameworks came under scrutiny, with audits revealing underfunding that strained operations and contributed to oversights. We track how county officials responded with pledges for increased funding, but critics maintained that preventive measures should have been in place long before. Lawmakers and government officials at state and federal levels were held responsible for not enacting reforms to child protection laws post-incident, despite the case's high profile. Advocacy campaigns pushed for legislative changes, like enhanced mandatory reporting and inter-agency protocols, arguing that inaction at this level allowed systemic issues to fester. Bills proposed in the aftermath aimed at bolstering oversight, but delays in passage drew further criticism, with groups like the National Association of Social Workers calling for accountability in policy making to break cycles of neglect. This layered accountability extended to how training deficiencies at DCFS reflected broader governmental oversights, where federal guidelines on child welfare weren't enforced stringently enough locally. We see in commission reports recommendations for cross-training between agencies, placing responsibility on policymakers to mandate such integrations. The media's role in sustaining pressure highlighted how public officials dragged their feet on reforms, with editorials in outlets like the Al Times urging voters to demand change. Child rights organizations emphasized that ultimate responsibility lay with those in power to allocate resources, arguing that chronic underinvestment directly enabled the lapses. In dissecting these elements, we align with expert views that shared blame across levels, from frontline workers to legislators, created a web of accountability that demanded comprehensive fixes to protect vulnerable kids moving forward. The fallout included personnel changes at DCFS, with several supervisors reassigned amid the backlash, signaling an attempt to address leadership failures. We pull from internal memos, showing how the agency revamped its risk assessment tools, though skeptics questioned the depth of these shifts without external oversight. Sheriff's Department reviews led to updated protocols for handling welfare checks, acknowledging their partial role in the chain of events. County administrators faced lawsuits and settlements related to the oversights, funneling funds toward improvements, but raising questions about preventive spending. At the state level, lawmakers introduced measures like Gabriel's Law, aimed at tightening reporting requirements, yet implementation hurdles drew ongoing criticism for slow progress. Federal scrutiny through Health and Human Services audits pointed to compliance issues, holding the government accountable for not upholding national standards. This multi-tiered responsibility framework, as dissected in documentaries and articles, underscores how oversights weren't just individual, but embedded in structures needing overhaul from the ground up. The precedent. We're connecting the Gabriel Fernandez case to a couple of similar ones for the channel, zeroing in on how parents or caregivers often turn out to be the main perpetrators who cover up their actions, while agencies like DCFS repeatedly overlook key reports leading to tragic ends. We start with the general ties, seeing how the Gabriel situation mirrors other child mistreatment cases in California, especially in how the parents or guardians are the ones inflicting the harm, and then hiding it through false reports to authorities, forcing siblings to lie about what happened, and blaming everything on accidents or the child's own self-harm. This pattern shows up time and again, with the perpetrators maintaining a facade of normalcy to avoid detection, much like in Gabriel's household where the cover-ups kept the mistreatment going under the radar. At the same time, agencies such as DCFS face heavy criticism for ignoring multiple alerts, which echoes the failures in Gabriel's timeline where teachers and relatives flagged issues but saw no real follow-through. These common threads highlight a systemic issue in LA County, where DCFS gets slammed for breakdowns in coordination with police and schools, resulting in preventable deaths that could have been stopped to better responses to the warnings. These parallels also underscore the recurring model in LA County, where DCFS comes under fire for institutional lapses, poor teamwork with law enforcement and educational institutions, and ultimately allowing situations to escalate without intervention. In Gabriel's instance, we have educators and family members sending in reports repeatedly, yet the agency didn't act swiftly enough, a scenario that plays out similarly to other cases, pointing to deeper problems like overloaded staff and flawed risk evaluations. This repetition fuels discussions on how such oversights aren't isolated, but part of a larger pattern, with critics arguing that better integration between departments could break the cycle. We note how these cases often lead to public outcry and calls for reform, yet the same issues persist, raising questions about accountability at every level from frontline workers to higher-ups. Moving to the first similar case, the Anthony Avalos situation from 2018 in Lancaster, California, involved a boy who suffered from mistreatment. Anthony's mother, Heather Barron, and her boyfriend, Kareem Leva, were the primary perpetrators, with Barron actively supporting Leva in the harm inflicted on her son, leading to his death. We track how Barron played a direct role in the ongoing mistreatment, not stepping in to stop it, but instead participating, which mirrors the dynamic where parents or guardians become the source of the danger rather than protection. Leva, as the boyfriend living in the home, took a leading hand in the acts, But Barron's involvement made it a joint effort, much like the partnership seen in other households where the biological parent enables or joins in with a partner. This setup emphasizes how family members closest to the child often end up as the ones causing the harm, turning the home into an unsafe space without outsiders realizing the extent, until it's too late. In terms of covering up, Barron and Leva went to lengths to hide what was happening, submitting false reports to social services, pressuring Anthony's siblings to lie about the origins of any visible marks, and pretending that Anthony was harming himself or getting into accidents on his own. This deception tactic aligns closely with strategies in comparable cases, where the perpetrators coach family members on what to say during visits or investigations, creating a unified front that misleads authorities. We see records showing how they dismissed concerns by attributing everything to Anthony's behavior, a move that bought them time and delayed any real scrutiny, similar to how false narratives kept interventions at bay in related incidents. The siblings, caught in the middle, faced intimidation to stick to the script, which prolonged the mistreatment and prevented early rescues. On the agency side, DCFS drew sharp criticism in the Anthony Avalos case for receiving at least 13 reports of mistreatment from teachers, police, counselors, and relatives between 2013 and 2018, yet failing to remove him from the home. This oversight stemmed from incomplete investigations and a lack of coordination with schools and law enforcement, where alerts from educators about unusual signs weren't pursued aggressively enough, and police involvement didn't lead to immediate protective steps. We pull from investigations showing how DCFS closed cases prematurely despite accumulating evidence, a pattern that critics link to understaffing and procedural flaws, much like the breakdowns that allowed mistreatment to continue unchecked in parallel situations. The agency's response often involved minimal home checks without digging deeper, which let the cover-ups succeed and escalated the risks. Linking the Anthony Avalos case back to Gabriel's, both unfolded in LA County, with the perpetrators being the mother and her boyfriend who inflicted the harm and concealed it by forcing lies from siblings and blaming accidents or self-inflicted issues. In both, DCFS overlooked numerous reports from schools and family, leading to widespread condemnation of the system and significant settlements, $32 million in Anthony's case, to address the failures. We observe how these similarities prompted reviews of DCFS practices. Yet the repetition suggests ongoing challenges in breaking the cycle of oversight. The settlements and public scrutiny in Anthony's aftermath echoed the calls for change after Gabriel, highlighting how these cases expose the same vulnerabilities in child protection networks. Shifting to the second similar case, the No Cuatro incident from 2019 in Palmdale, California, centered on a boy who succumbed to severe mistreatment. Noah's father, Jose Cuatro, and mother, Ursula Juarez, were the main culprits, both actively engaging in the harm that led to his death, with no one in the household stepping up to halt it. Juarez, as the mother, participated directly alongside Cuatro, creating a united front in the mistreatment, which parallels scenarios where parents collaborate in creating dangerous environments for their children. Cuatro took on a dominant role in the acts, but Juarez's involvement made it a parental duo responsible, emphasizing how biological parents can become the primary threats when internal dynamics turn toxic. For concealment, Cuatro and Juarez tactics like filing false reports, claiming accidents such as drowning incidents, avoiding medical examinations, and pressuring other children in the home to stay silent about any visible problems. This approach allowed them to deflect suspicion during interactions with outsiders. Similar to methods used in other cases where perpetrators manipulate narratives to portray normalcy. We find details in records where they dodged follow-ups by providing misleading information, which kept authorities from uncovering the truth sooner and prolonged the hidden mistreatment. The siblings, under duress, withheld details, extending the cover-up and mirroring how family pressure silences potential witnesses in these situations. Agency oversights loomed large in Noah's case, with DCFS fielding multiple reports of mistreatment from 2014 to 2019, including calls from relatives, like his Aunt Maggie Hernandez, to hotlines, as well as alerts from schools and doctors, but never removing him from the home. This failure involved poor coordination with police, who didn't push for deeper probes, and a lack of timely medical checks despite accumulating concerns. Investigations later revealed how DCFS mishandled the volume of tips, closing inquiries without comprehensive reviews, a flaw attributed to resource strains and procedural gaps that echoed criticisms in comparable incidents. We note how relatives' persistent efforts to flag issues went unheeded, allowing the mistreatment to escalate without intervention. Connecting Noah Coitro's case to Gabriel's. Both took place in Palmdale, with the parents as the perpetrators, who caused the harm, and hid it through false reports and silencing family members. DCFS in both instances ignored repeated alerts, resulting in systemic backlash, a $20 million settlement in 2025 for Noah's family, and pushes for reforms like Gabriel's law to bolster child protections. These links show a troubling local pattern, where parental cover-ups succeed amid agency lapses, prompting ongoing demands for better training and interdepartmental links. In Noah's aftermath, we see similar internal audits at DCFS, acknowledging the same coordination failures that plagued Gabriel's handling, yet the repetition raises alarms about slow progress in fixing these entrenched issues. Expanding on these connections, we observe how in all three cases, Gabriel, Anthony, and Noah, the parental figures, often including the mother and a partner, emerge as the central actors in the mistreatment, not outsiders, which flips the typical expectation of family as a safe haven. This insider threat, combined with deliberate concealment strategies like coached lies and accident claims, allows the situations to fester longer, as seen in the way siblings in each were manipulated to support the false narratives. For Gabriel, the cover-ups involved blaming self-harm, for Anthony, similar self-inflicted excuses, and for Noah, accident fabrications like drowning, all tactics that delayed detection and intervention. These methods aren't random, they exploit the trust authorities place in parental accounts, making it harder for agencies to pierce the veil without aggressive follow-ups. The agency side reveals even more parallels, with DCFS consistently criticized for overlooking reports despite their frequency and sources, from schools spotting behavioral changes to relatives dialing hotlines with direct concerns. In Gabriel's timeline, teacher alerts went unaddressed. In Anthony's, a dozen-plus tips from various parties were dismissed, and in Noah's, years of family and medical flags led nowhere. We track how this pattern points to systemic overload, where high caseloads lead to superficial checks, an issue highlighted in post-case reviews across Ella County. The lack of synergy with police, where law enforcement might have enforced removals in schools, which often see daily signs, compounds the problem, as evidenced by the incomplete investigations in each case. These cases also share geographic and institutional overlaps, with Gabriel and Noah both in Palmdale, and Anthony nearby in Lancaster, all under LA County's jurisdiction, suggesting localized vulnerabilities in DCFS operations. Settlements in Anthony's, $32 million, and Noah's, $20 million, reflect the financial toll of these failures, much like the scrutiny following Gabriel. Yet they underscore how monetary fixes don't always translate to immediate changes. Reforms like Gabriel's law, inspired by the first case, aim to tighten reporting and coordination, but their slow rollout post-Noah shows ongoing hurdles. We see in reports how these incidents spurred commission inquiries, like the Blue Ribbon Group after Gabriel, echoing calls for better training after Anthony and Noah. Yet the repetition indicates that while awareness grows, implementation lags. Diving into the parental roles more, in Gabriel's home, the mother and boyfriend duo set the stage. Anthony's mirrored that with mother and boyfriend. Noah's involved both biological parents, showing variations but consistent family betrayal. The concealment in each relied on internal control, siblings coerced in all three, false reports to agencies, avoidance of medical scrutiny, which prolonged the mistreatment and highlighted how perpetrators exploit system gaps. For instance, in Anthony's case, the 13 reports spanned years without removal, paralleling Gabriel's multi-alert timeline and Noah's extended flags from 2014 onward. Agency flags stands as the common denominator, with DCFS's failures in coordination leading to preventable escalations. We note how in Noah's situation, Aunt Maggie's hotline calls mirrored the relative reports in Gabriel's. Yet both saw in action. Anthony's teacher and counselor tips echoed Gabriel's school alerts, all dismissed due to similar procedural shortcomings. This pattern fuels arguments for mandated cross-checks, where police and schools could force deeper dives. But as seen, such measures weren't in place, allowing cover-ups to thrive. These ties ultimately illustrate a broader crisis in child welfare, where parental mistreatment hides behind deception, and agencies' oversights enable it, calling for sustained scrutiny as we compile for the channel. The settlements and laws emerging from these cases represent steps forward, but the closeness in time and place, Gabriel in 2013, Anthony in 2018, Noah in 2019, signals that changes haven't fully taken root, leaving room for more analysis on preventing future repetitions. The sentence. In the end, we're comparing the sentences handed down in the Gabriel Fernandez case to those in the Emmanuel Haro case for this segment on the channel, highlighting how the severity in Gabriel's situation stands out and why penalties like these are fully justified in delivering justice. In Gabriel's case, Pearl Fernandez received a life sentence without the possibility of parole in June 2018 for first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture, a ruling that underscored her central role in the prolonged mistreatment that ended her son's life. Isauro Aguirre, her boyfriend, was sentenced to death that same month for the same charge, though execution has been on hold due to California's moratorium on capital punishment since 2019. Over in the Emmanuel Haro case, Jake Haro got 25 years to life on November 3, 2025 for second-degree murder, plus additional time for child mistreatment and filing false reports, pushing his total over 30 years behind bars. Rebecca Haro, his wife, faced sentencing for aiding in the cover-up and false statements, but the latest sources haven't detailed her exact term yet. Looking at the contrasts, the penalties in Gabriel's case hit harder overall, with the death penalty for Aguirre and life without parole for Pearl reflecting a judicial view of the events as exceptionally grave due to the extended period of mistreatment over months. We see this in how the court classified it as first-degree murder with torture enhancements, signaling a deliberate and sustained pattern that demanded the maximum response under California law. By comparison, Emmanuel's case landed as second-degree murder, which carries a lighter baseline, 15 years to life, but got bumped up with add-ons for prior mistreatment and deception, resulting in that 25 to life stretch for Jake. This difference points to prosecutors and judges seeing Gabriel's ordeal as more calculated and prolonged, justifying the escalation to capital punishment territory, while Emmanuel's was framed as reckless, but not quite reaching that premeditated threshold. The severity in Gabriel's situation really comes through when we weigh the evidence that swayed the court, like sibling testimonies and forensic details, showing a systematic approach to the mistreatment, culminating in brain death. Judges in that trial described it as one of the most egregious child mistreatment cases they'd encountered, which fed into the harsh sentences as a way to acknowledge the depth of the suffering involved. In Emmanuel's proceedings, the mistreatment led to death as well, but the record didn't emphasize the same drawn-out intensity or variety of methods, so the charge stopped at second degree, reflecting a view of it as gravely wrong but perhaps more impulsive. We note how this distinction affected the outcomes. Gabriel's perpetrators got locked into irrevocable punishments, while Jake's sentence allows for parole consideration after 25 years, though the extras make release unlikely soon. Both cases share long-term incarceration, but Gabriel stands out with the torture special circumstance, pushing it to the death row level. A clear signal from the system that such extended mistreatment crosses into the most heinous category. This isn't just about the labels, it's how the law in California reserves capital or no parole life for acts deemed especially cruel, and Gabriel's fit that bill based on the buildup of reports and eventual revelations. Emmanuel's, while serious with its history of mistreatment, got treated as a high-end manslaughter equivalent, showing how prosecutors calibrate charges to the perceived intent and duration. We pull from court transcripts where judges in Gabriel's hearing stressed the need for sentences that match the atrocity, contrasting with Emmanuel's where the focus was on the immediate events leading to death without the same emphasis on prolonged patterns. Emphasizing Gabriel's gravity further, the case involved layers of deception and family involvement that amplified its horror, with the court noting how the mistreatment wasn't a one-off, but a routine that eroded the child's well-being over time. This led to sentences that effectively removed the offenders from society forever, a fitting response given the irreversible harm. Compared to Emmanuel, where the mistreatment preceded death, but lacked the documented extended timeline in court arguments, Gabriel's drew a starker line, resulting in penalties that leave no room for leniency. We see this in how Aguirre's death sentence, even if paused, symbolizes the ultimate condemnation, while Pearl's life term ensures perpetual confinement, both tailored to the case's weight. On the flip side, these sentences are entirely appropriate for incidents of this nature, with Gabriel's capital and life punishments serving as deterrents and affirmations of justice for the victim, aligning with how the U.S. Legal system treats severe child mistreatment as top-tier crimes. In Emmanuel's ruling, Jake's 25 to life plus add-ons demonstrates rigor too, but Gabriel's case illustrates why prolonged scenarios warrant the max, to uphold fairness and discourage repeats. Both verdicts fit their contexts, with Gabriel exemplifying deserved severity for systematic mistreatment, and Emmanuel reflecting calibrated justice for second degree with aggravating factors. Delving deeper, the Gabriel sentences came after a trial where the prosecution built a narrative of intentional cruelty, leading the judge to impose the harshest options available, a move praised by advocates as setting a standard for accountability in child mistreatment. This contrasts with Emmanuel's plea deal structure, where the second-degree charge allowed for a sentence that's stern but not absolute, showing how evidence of intent influences outcomes. We consider how in Gabriel, the special circumstances clause for torture was pivotal, elevating it beyond standard murder, whereas Emmanuel stayed at a level where parole remains possible, underscoring the perceived difference in malice. The appropriateness shines through in how Gabriel's penalties match the outrage from the details revealed, providing closure through permanent removal, while still respecting legal bounds like the moratorium. For Emmanuel, the over 30-year total for Jake ensures long-term consequences, but Gabriel's case pushes the envelope with death and life without, justified by the extent that shocked the court. These rulings reinforce that when mistreatment escalates to fatal levels with cover-ups, the system responds proportionally, with Gabriel as a benchmark for the most extreme responses. Further, Gabriel's sentencing hearing included victim impact statements that highlighted the lasting trauma, influencing the judge to go full measure, a process that Emmanuel's shared but with less emphasis on duration. We note how both cases involved add-ons for deception, false reports in Emmanuel, cover-ups in Gabriel, but the latter's led to unbreakable terms, fitting the narrative of sustained harm. This comparison shows the law's flexibility in scaling punishment to severity, with Gabriel demanding the pinnacle due to its scope. In Emmanuel, Rebecca's role in concealment drew charges, but her undetermined sentence leaves it open, unlike Pearl's locked-in life, pointing to Gabriel's as more comprehensive in addressing all parties. The sentences in both affirm that mistreatment ending in death merits heavy time, but Gabriel's torture enhancement justifies the apex penalties, ensuring they resonate as deserved retribution. Overall, the Gabriel verdicts stand taller in severity, with life and death reflecting a case viewed as profoundly disturbing, while Emmanuel's 25 to life captures its gravity without reaching that peak. These outcomes are spot on for the crimes, delivering measured justice that honors the victims and signals zero tolerance for such acts. We see in the details how courts weigh factors like duration and intent, making Gabriel's a model for maximum accountability in extended mistreatment, and Emmanuel's a solid response to reckless fatal harm with priors. The sentences not only punish but educate, showing that the system calibrates to the facts, with Gabriel's pushing boundaries to match its horror. Wrapping up this deep dive into the Gabriel Fernandez case, we've covered a lot of ground, but the issues surrounding it are far from resolved and still demand more explanation. We'll keep digging into this story and its implications in the upcoming videos. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.